Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the seminar on the climate scoping plan. This is actually the second one that the Alliance for Clean Energy has held, and our goal is to provide a forum where folks can learn more about the climate scoping plan that the Climate Action Council spent a couple of years working on. There's so much detail in there, and we wanted it to cover it in more than just one webinar. So our first one focused on the plan overall, and today we're going to focus on what is in the climate scoping plan for transportation. So we're going to take a deeper dive into the transportation chapter. And once again, this plan was finalized and adopted this past December by the Climate Action Council. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Anne Reynolds. I'm with the Alliance for Clean Energy. And many of you who are joining today are probably members of ACE New York, so thank you for joining, but many of you are not, so welcome. And I will let you just know a bit about ACE New York if you're not a member. We are a member-based and mission-driven organization. We have a mission to promote clean energy in New York State, and our members are companies that are engaged in distributed solar and utility-scale solar, wind power, offshore wind power, battery storage, transportation electrification, and building decarbonation. And we also have members that are labor organizations, environmental organizations, consultant to the clean energy industry, and educational organizations. We also have members that do hydroelectric. I think I didn't mention that one. So welcome. We are aiming to be the voice of the clean energy industry here in New York State. And as part of that, we're trying to educate the public about what is in the climate action plan. So I do have a few logistical announcements. The slides will be available and shared with those who registered for the webinar. That's always the first question that people ask. The webinar will be recorded and shared with those who registered as well. It also will be posted on the ACE New York website for anyone to watch. If you want to ask a question, and we hope that you do, please type it into the Q&A function in Zoom. That should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do that at any time during the presentations or at the end. And then after the presentations, we will try to get through as many questions as we can for our panelists. So as I said, ACE New York, among many other organizations, has been an active participant in the development of this plan, as have thousands of state residents who attended hearings and submitted written comments. And we want to ensure that legislators, government leaders, civic organizations, and ordinary New Yorkers know what's in the plan. And know what's not in the plan, because you do hear some information about things that aren't actually in there. We had, as I said, we had a seminar in January with an overview. I should have said this was the third, because earlier in the month we had one focused on buildings decarbonization. And as I said, today we're looking at transportation. And we're going to hold one more on the electricity chapter in May. We have a great perfect person to serve as the moderator for today's event, which is Nick Sifuentes of the Summit Foundation. And as I understand it, Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you now to run things from here. Is that right?
Wonderful. That sounds great. Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. I'm Nick Sifuentes. I'm the director of the Sustainable Cities program at the Summit Foundation. Previously, I led grant making for the Northeast for the Energy Foundation, and I had the pleasure of meeting many of you during my time as the executive director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign and deputy director of the Riders Alliance. So I want to thank you for being here this morning, and I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start with Adam Reuter. Adam Reuter is the assistant director for NYSERDA's Clean Transportation Group. That group focuses on developing and demonstrating new technologies, policies, and business models that support three key focus areas: electric vehicles, public transportation, and mobility management. Adam has led the implementation of Governor Cuomo's Charge New York initiative to advance electric vehicle adoption in New York State, and he closely collaborates with other states and the federal government to jointly advance EV policies and programs. Before joining NYSERDA in 2008, Adam received a Master in Public Policy degree from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Next up, we'll have Chris LaLone, who is a director of the Division of Air Resources for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC. Chris holds a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Clarkson University and has been a licensed professional engineer since 1996. Prior to beginning his career with DEC, Chris had 5 years of experience working for the Department of Defense and at a coal-fired power plant. And for the past 28 years, Chris has worked for the Department of Environmental Conservation in varying capacities and in 4 different offices. He was appointed as director of the Division of Air Resources in May 2021 after serving as assistant director for the division since early 2020. And prior to taking on those duties, Chris had extensive experience in stationary source permitting, inspections and enforcement at the staff level, and as supervisor of the enforcement section, and then as supervisor of the permitting and compliance section. He's also worked for 2 years as a regional engineer in the DEC R9 Buffalo office, where he was responsible for supervision of all environmental quality staff covering 6 counties in Western New York. And lastly, Alok Disa is a senior research and policy analyst for the Northeast Regional Office of Earthjustice in New York, where he supports the region's energy, agriculture, and toxics docket. He specializes in environmental and energy policy, stakeholder engagement, policy analysis, and quantitative modeling. Alok is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And those are our panelists for today. We're very excited to dig into the conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Adam for his presentation. Adam, you're up.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Really excited to be here. Let's move to the next slide and jump right in. So, just to give the quick overview, transportation emissions are essential to meeting the goals. Reducing transportation emissions are essential to meeting the goals of the scoping plan and of CLCPA in general. They make up about 28% of New York State greenhouse gas emissions. And the big challenge with transportation is that there is no one silver bullet. The emissions are spread out over multiple different modes, different types of vehicles, and different different business structures and ownership structures and all that. So we need to have a comprehensive approach if we're going to make an impact. Next slide. And we need to make a big impact. By 2030, the modeling that was behind the scoping plan suggests that nearly 100% of all light-duty vehicle sales and at least 40% of medium and heavy-duty vehicle sales should be zero emissions. This is a big shift from today, where last year we had a great year and about 6% of light-duty vehicle sales were zero emission, and only a handful of medium and heavy duty vehicle sales were. So, but that alone is not enough. We need to be investing in public transportation, micromobility, other forms of mobility, and really in an all-out effort to not just shift to zero emission vehicles, but also to reduce vehicle miles traveled. We need to look at a wide range of approaches to that, but because there is, as I said in the last slide, there's no one approach that will get us as far as we need to go. By 2050, we see this as really a completing the shift to zero emission vehicles, shifting some other types of operations like marine and port facilities to electric where that's appropriate. Some subsectors are going to be very difficult to electrify and may rely on green hydrogen or renewable biofuels. But engaging industry and finding ways to have public-private collaboration are going to be critical to meeting all of these goals. Next slide. So, we see this as a multi-pronged approach. The scoping plan highlights a few different key themes of how we're going to do this. Transitioning to zero emission vehicles and equipment, enhancing public transportation and mobility alternatives, smart growth and mobility-oriented development, and market-based solutions and financing. And I'm going to dig into a little bit more detail on each of those now. So next slide. On zero-emission vehicles and equipment. I'll let Chris talk about the regulatory side, but in addition to the regulatory side, we all are in agreement that we need to be providing more ZEV purchase incentives. So that could be through for light duty vehicles, something like a rebate, where the rebates for vehicles are essentially funded through a fee on combustion vehicles. And then just generally more incentives for medium and heavy duty vehicles, which are going to be difficult to electrify. There's still a big price premium there. And we need to get moving very quickly. I know Alok will talk a lot more about that. We need to be investing a lot more in the ZEV charging and fueling infrastructure, including removing barriers like finding appropriate utility rates and doing more on permitting, as well as direct investments in both the stations themselves and also proactive investments in electrical infrastructure. And we're starting to make a lot of progress on some of these fronts. You know, the utility rate design, the Public Service Commission already has issued an order since the scoping plan was finalized that sets that in motion. And just last week, the Public Service Commission opened a proceeding that is going to look into how we can do proactive investments in electrical infrastructure to in advance of the need for zero emission vehicles, so that that is not a holdup as we want to deploy more and more of these vehicles. We recognize that there's a lot of work to do on consumer awareness and reducing sales barriers as well. And this was something that was recognized by the CAC. And we need to require and you know, another angle here is working on state fleet and state contractors and through some targeted facilities, such as the executive order that has since come out that is really a good push for state fleet electrification. Also consideration of procurement or contracting rules to increase the percentage of zero emission equipment and vehicles used for state funded projects. And then, you know, California is working on these advanced clean fleets rules. I think Chris may touch on that as well. But that's another angle for targeting certain fleets that we think are important to electrify. Next slide. On the topic of public transportation and smart growth, there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we need to do to really expand transit service. One of the key elements there is that that's not a one size fits all policy or program. This really needs to be done with input from communities, understanding what's going to work in one geography versus another. But that could look like increasing the frequency and scope of services and really bringing more modes of travel into what we think of as transit. Improving transit ease of use. You know, this could look like integrating new technology like mobile apps and different payment forms to make transit easier to use and also to make it easier to transfer between modes to you know, go from a bus to an e-scooter or something like that. Investing in mobility-oriented development is going to be really critical. These types of land use patterns are where transit and low VMT lifestyles are going to be most supported and most realistic and most advantageous to residents. And so making sure that we are doing what we can from the land use side to make sure that our land use patterns are supporting our transportation goals is going to be critical. We can do that in part by updating the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act. and funding new mobility options, low emission zones, and car-free streets, which I know we've seen really expanding quite significantly over the last few years, but I think we need to do a lot more. And then investing in emerging technologies that enable low carbon transportation modes, like intelligent transportation systems, autonomous vehicles, in a way that they can actually save energy and not just promote longer trips. And then doing what we can in other ways with technology on that front. Next slide. And then touching on market-based policies, I think this is really about aligning the policy landscape and pricing policies in particular with the travel choices we want people to take. So that could be variable pricing parking pricing policies to encourage people to not drive when it's going to be in congested or hard to park, or when there are other better options. Shifting to a system that of mileage-based fees from the gas tax, which hopefully will be obsolete with before too long, if all of this is successful. Working on the financing side of things to make sure that there's a robust pipeline of financing options for fleets that are looking to electrify in particular, but also for development. And then considering implementing a clean transportation standard. I know there was a lot of discussion about this in the Climate Action Council proceedings, but this is a variation on a policy that is in place on the West Coast that requires fossil fuel providers to reduce the carbon content of their fuels, either by blending lower carbon fuels into the mix or acquiring credits from providers of low carbon fuels like electricity or hydrogen. This can be structured a number of different ways. There was a lot of detail put into the scoping plan about what this could look like, and I think this will require a lot more thought and development, but I think is a good option to help push toward a cleaner transportation sector. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight a few items of current and upcoming funding that are really helping to advance these goals right now. New York State has had a Drive Clean rebate for electric vehicles for 6 years now, and we've provided nearly 100,000 of them since the program started. I think we're getting close to that milestone, but up to $2,000 off the purchase price of cars. That's in addition to whatever federal incentives are available, tax credits, and then we also have our program for trucks and buses, the truck voucher incentive program. Both of these are point of sale, which I think is really important, brings the purchase price down immediately. We have $66 million that we've set aside for the truck voucher program, but to really get to these goals, we're going to need to expand that pretty dramatically. The first step in that is the Environmental Bond Act. The $500 million of the Environmental Bond Act that passed in November is set aside for electrifying school buses in New York State. So we're in the process of developing that now that that's been passed. Next slide. There's a lot of different programs that the state has put in place for expanding EV charging infrastructure. Between the Public Service Commission's Make Ready program and alternative EV tariffs that I mentioned earlier, NYPA's Evolve New York program that's building fast charging stations across the state, the federally funded National EV Infrastructure Program, which is $175 million that is running through DOT. NYSERDA has a program for level 2 and for fast charging stations. DEC has a program, and there are tax credits. We are really trying to touch all the different pieces of the market here and try to make sure that charging is available for folks as they're ready to buy, and that's not a holdup, and we can even use charging to accelerate adoption. Next slide. There are also a lot of federal funding opportunities. I'm not going to go through all these in detail. Maybe that can wait till the Q&A if we want. But between tax credits and a number of multi-billion-dollar programs, EPA just came out with its next round of its clean school bus program that earlier this week. I mentioned the NEVI program, and then there's also a competitive element of that too. There's almost $20 billion of the expanded CMAQ program and carbon reduction program through Federal Highway Administration. Excuse me. EPA has these carbon pollution reduction grants that they're starting to roll out, and that's going to be a competitive program that has an initial planning process and then a competitive process. A number of programs focused on electrifying transit and expanding transit. There's going to be a $1 billion medium and heavy duty truck program and many more. That's really just scratching the surface. But we're really fortunate to have a lot of support from the federal side. New York, I will mention, has been very successful in competing for this money. New York won more of the EPA Clean School Bus Program money in the first round than any other state, and we plan to continue to do so. And next slide, I think, is the last one. We also see a real opportunity going forward for additional funding for these types of programs. I mentioned earlier that the Public Service Commission just last week initiated their medium and heavy duty make ready proceeding, which is going to look at how utilities can better support medium and heavy duty charging infrastructure. Cap and invest. I know Chris will touch on this as well, but it is a potentially very large source of funding for transportation investments as well as other investments. The important thing about it is it will be recurring, and I think there's been a real push toward investing the proceeds in disadvantaged communities where possible. And then I mentioned earlier the Clean Transportation Standard, but that it also could be a good source of investment opportunities for clean transportation. So I probably went a little long there, but thanks for listening, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Adam. That was fantastic. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. But before I do, I just want to remind everybody, I'm seeing some good questions come in the Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A so that we can get to those during the live Q&A session at the end of the presentations today. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about, what my agency, in particular my division, is working on as required or as mentioned in the scoping plan, transportation sector. So I noted 3 different regulatory actions kind of mentioned in the transportation sector. Advanced clean trucks was mentioned, and that's an action we've already taken, but it was mentioned, and it's obviously an important part of that sector's reduction in emissions. There's advanced clean cars too, and there's advanced clean fleets, again, on the heavy duty side. And then there's, as Adam noted, the Clean Transportation Standard. So you can go to the next slide. So a couple of things that aren't in the transportation sector, but maybe one of them certainly is another part of the scoping plan, but will have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions as part of our recent heavy duty NOx omnibus rule package. There is a phase 2 greenhouse gas standard in there for heavy duty vehicles that we basically have adopted under an emergency rulemaking as part of the heavy duty NOx omnibus. And then the cap and invest, obviously that will have aggressively look for reductions from fuels that are used in the transportation sector. Next slide. So I'll try to go through each of those 6 items a little bit more information. So like I said, the advanced clean trucks is kind of the first step that we took. It was done, early on before the scoping plan was final, but it's still an important part of that scoping plan, I think, in reducing emissions from heavy duty and medium duty vehicles. It starts with model year 2025, which could essentially be as early as next January. There's zero emission vehicle standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles. The requirements are on the original equipment manufacturers to meet a certain sales requirement. And then there was also, as part of that, a large entity reporting requirement. Next slide. So these are basically a breakdown of the categories that are involved in ACT. You can see there's different class vehicles and actually different sales percentages for those class vehicles by model year. So 2024 will not be in New York State, does not apply in New York State. So we will start with model year 2025 and those percentages. You can see this goes up to 2035 and beyond. There's some other things going on or in the works that will address kind of beyond 2035. Next slide. The other part of this is a large entity reporting requirement. This is really, this gives some info here on, who may be required to report on that, what size fleets, what type of entities they may be. We had a reporting requirement that was due just past this April 1st, 2023. That was when these businesses and these fleets were supposed to report to us. The hope here is kind of tying in with the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation to give us some more information to work with in, making decisions on where we want to go with the Advanced Clean Fleet rules if we go that route. Next slide, please. So the next thing that was in the scoping plan was the Advanced Clean Cars 2. This has two parts to it. There is a zero emission vehicle standard similar to ACT. It sets a percentage by year for the original equipment manufacturers to meet sales requirements. There's also, and probably not talked about much, there is the low emission vehicle, and this is the fourth iteration of that standard. So these are standards on your regular internal combustion engine vehicles, and the emission standards for those have been reduced again. So we adopted this regulation with emergency adoption at the end of last year. Even when we do that, we still have to go through our formal regulatory process. So we had a 60-day comment period and a public hearing, and we are in the process of reviewing those comments now and trying to finalize that regulation. Next slide. So this is the taken from CARB. This is the sales target that we must meet. So we would start with model year 2026. So you can see that's very aggressive to go from where, as Dan mentioned, where we are now to 35%. And, you basically have, looks like 10 model years here to get up to 100% sales. Next slide, please. As part of this regulation, there's a number of things going on. There's changing the way that credits are calculated in this program. Tried to simplify it. If you have a vehicle, is that what's considered a ZEV? You get one vehicle credit, and those credits have a shorter useful life now. There's some other changes. Another big part of that is the ZEV flexibilities, which covers a number of things. It allows some use of historical credits that were used under the Advanced Clean Cars 1 program, some early compliance credits. So if manufacturers do some things where the model years prior to 2026, they can get some credits for those. It allows pooling between states. There's a number of states that have adopted or are planning to adopt Advanced Clean Cars 2. And then the last part of that is there's some environmental justice credit programs that the state is supposed to stand up. So we're kind of in the early process of looking at those programs and how we might do that. And then the last thing, there's some assurance measures. So, and they basically say, require minimum ranges for certain type of vehicles. ZEVs or plug-in hybrids. They require minimal durability, so a useful life, 10 years or 150,000 miles for the model years 2026 to 2029, and then 10 years and 150,000 miles and a minimum range of 80% for beyond model year 2030. There's also some battery labeling requirements in there, and some requirements for charging cords being part of the purchase of those vehicles. Next slide, please. As I said, there's other emission standards in there, so there's going to be some new requirements on ICE vehicles, your traditional light-duty cars and SUVs and trucks. They're going to reduce the emission standard for non-methane organics and NOx, and also reduce the emission standard for particulate matter from those engines. Next slide, please. So we're not alone in this, right? California's not alone. New York's not alone. It's not just 2 states. There's a number of states now that have adopted some of the California regulations that are allowed to adopt them under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. Some of these states have adopted all of what California's done. Some have adopted parts. Some are looking at other parts. So it's a work in progress. Next slide, please. So another item that was mentioned that the state's DEC should adopt the Advanced Clean Fleet regulations that CARB, California, is working on. CARB is the California Air Resources Board. So they are working on those. They just had a second hearing on that rulemaking package. They are hoping to adopt the regulations later in the year. There are 4 parts to that package. There is state and government fleet requirements. There's high priority fleet requirements. There's drayage truck requirements, and then there's basically to where ACT ended at 2035, there's a requirement to get up to 100% sales by 2040. The scoping plans specifically picked out the 3 highlighted requirements there that the state should adopt. So that's something that we're following closely with California. Obviously, we can't adopt those until California does. So we're following that process closely and deciding what we want to do as far as those regulations. Next slide. And the last thing mentioned in the transportation section was Clean Transportation Standard, and this is basically the wording that we should evaluate, consider adopting a variation of a clean fuel standard to support transition to electrification, expanded transit, and clean transportation alternatives. That's something we're not actively looking at right now. We're kind of all in on the cap and invest rulemaking process, which will also address emissions from transportation fuels. So we're working on that first, and we still have the Clean Transportation Standard as an option should we decide it's needed. Next slide. As I mentioned, the things that we did do that aren't mentioned in the scoping plan, there's a heavy-duty phase 2 greenhouse gas standard. So this was part of our heavy-duty NOx omnibus package, which greatly reduced NOx emissions from heavy-duty vehicles. This was adopted at the end of 2022 as well. We're saying, just like the advanced clean cars, we have to go through that formal rulemaking process. So we're again in that assessment of public comment process right now. So essentially, this isn't going to result in any big greenhouse gas reductions. It's going to allow us to be identical with California requirements, which we are required to do for the same vehicle classes. And the California and the federal greenhouse gas phase 2 rules are pretty closely harmonized. So in the future, the federal government is looking at the phase 3 greenhouse gas rules for heavy duty vehicles. That was just noticed, I think, either today or yesterday. So there's more work to go on heavy duty greenhouse gas standards. The next slide. And, you know, the last thing is really our cap and invest. That is obviously a big part of the scoping plan, but not directly tied to transportation. We are actively working on these regulations. There'll be reporting requirements, and there'll be allowance requirements. Obviously, this will require reductions from fossil fuel suppliers and transporters in New York State, and so will go a long ways to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and actually emissions of other pollutants from vehicles, mobile sources across the state. I believe that was my last slide. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Very much appreciate that. Once again, remind folks the Q&A box is open, and we will begin taking questions after Alok's presentation. And Alok, you are up.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate the invitation by ACE New York to go deep into the transportation chapter, which I spent a lot of my time looking into. So happy to share some of those insights with everyone here this morning. So yeah, my name is Alok Disa. For those that don't know me, I'm a senior research and policy analyst with Earthjustice. And for folks who are not familiar with Earthjustice, we are the premier nonprofit public interest environmental law organization. We wield the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, preserve magnificent places of wildlife, advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. And so I help lead the transportation and some of the climate work in our Northeast regional team, which really focuses on New York. So next slide, please. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about here in the next few slides here over the next few minutes. Just kind of want to go a little bit drill down into the sort of transportation emissions that Adam laid out and how they look and where they shake out and we'll find that, you know, diesel powered trucks and buses emerge as an important area for focus. So then how do we fix it? And so I'm going to talk about one of the big strategies that Earthjustice has prioritized, which is electrifying trucks and buses. Where are we going? So take a deep dive within the deep dive, I guess, and really zooming in on what the scoping plan says about medium and heavy duty vehicles in particular, what's in there, what it says about where the state needs to go, and maybe some areas where there needs to be further attention. So that's the last part of what I'm going to be covering. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Thanks. So here's a snapshot of the transportation of the fuel combustion emissions across the state from 1990 to 2019. So what you see here at the top is this pink line at the very top shows that transportation is very high important source of greenhouse gas emissions. Using the global warming potential, the 20-year global warming potential, if you combine residential and commercial, that's where buildings does exceed transportation. So, you know, using the state's metric, buildings as a collective is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. But the way that the most recent inventory broke it down in terms of fuel combustion emissions, this is how they broke it down. So you see the transportation well above any sector in this chart. And a couple other things that are worth noting in this chart as we think about the transportation sector is compared to 1990, we see it's maybe a little bit hard or a little gradual, but transportation sector emissions are up quite a bit since 1990. And compared to many of these other sectors, if not all of them, have actually gone down. So transportation emissions are remaining stubbornly high, despite the the introduction of fuel economy standards at the federal level and things of that nature. And that's largely because driving bigger cars and more VMT, more vehicle miles traveled. So a couple takeaways: transportation emissions have gone up pretty substantially since 1990, while most of these other sectors are actually on a downward trend. And then drilling down further into the transportation sector emissions, next slide, please. What you find here is that diesel emissions are actually are responsible for a lot of that increase within the transportation sector. And so this chart, this orange line at the top is gasoline, everyday light duty cars and trucks. So still represents the lion's share of our transportation emissions in terms of fuel usage. But as you can see, it's on the chart, it's been roughly, overall emissions are roughly flat since 1990 from gasoline powered vehicles. But then if you go further down, representing a smaller share of the overall kind of pie of transportation emissions, but this pink one, the second one from the top, so the pink line is diesel. And you see since 1990, it's gone up, looks like roughly about 50% or more up to 2019. And so within the transportation sector, that's a large chunk of the actual emissions increase that we've seen since 1990. A lot of that is can be tied to diesel vehicles. So, and when we think of diesel vehicles, it's almost entirely, really, we're talking about medium duty trucks, heavy duty trucks, buses, heavy equipment, things like that. So, so that's why. So when you look at these two charts together, it really becomes clear that focusing on diesel is an important priority to really ratchet down and bend the curve of transportation emissions. Next slide, please. And then what this chart shows is why the other aspect of diesel emissions and why we view maybe the key imperative at the intersection of environment and public health is reducing and eliminating diesel emissions and diesel exposure to diesel emissions because of their disproportionate impact on public health. So what this chart shows, it's a little bit, maybe the color scheme probably could have been a little bit better on my part, but so this breaks down the whole vehicle, all the vehicle sector into light duty autos on the left, so cars, light duty trucks, second to the left from the left, so like pickup trucks, things like that. And then on the right three are medium duty trucks, heavy duty trucks, and buses. And those are mostly diesel powered. Those are the bigger trucks. A lot few, so when we think of in terms of the overall population of vehicles on the road in New York State, almost a huge percentage of them are the light duty autos, light duty trucks. A comparatively much smaller percentage are these buses and trucks. But their impact on mortality and public health are disproportionately high given the small share of the vehicle population that they represent. So the pink bar is a mortality attributed to PM 2.5, the orange from ozone, and these numbers come from a recent study that looked at states across the East and found that really trucks and buses are responsible for a huge share of the public health impact from transportation. Next slide, please. And what this slide shows is that we don't all breathe the same air, that there's racial disparities in who gets to breathe cleaner air in New York State. And so there's a lot to kind of go into in this chart. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists who looked at inequitable exposure to air pollution from vehicles in New York State. And so what in this chart, the dark blue bar at the bottom of each of the charts, they represent the share of white people in a given category. And what we see on the far left is that dark blue share is 82%. And so white people are basically overrepresented in the parts of the state that have the cleanest air, and people of color are kind of underrepresented. And as you go further out into the parts of the state that have the worst air quality in terms of PM 2.5 exposure, the share of white people goes down and the share of people of color goes up. So I think there's a lot of different charts and ways we could have told this story, but I think this chart does a good job of explaining just the inherent inequities in exposure to transportation emissions. And in fact, transportation emissions are one of the main drivers for the existing inequalities that we see in terms of air pollution exposure. So next slide, please. All right, yeah, thanks. So what can we do about it? So electrification is really the key to reducing emissions equitably. The authors of that study that had the bars that I showed a couple slides ago, they found that electrifying bus fleets in the New York region will have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of generating health benefits. And in fact, medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification more broadly has been identified as a priority to reduce ozone levels across the region. And ozone is a big issue for New York State because it actually the New York City region and Long Island and Westchester and Rockland County, they're part of a federal non-attainment area. They fail to meet the federal air quality standards for ozone. And in fact, it's the highest ozone levels are found in our region east of the Mississippi. The whole eastern part of the country, we have the worst ozone pollution, and the levels have been kind of stubbornly high. And the people who look at this stuff very carefully have found that diesel vehicles are largely responsible for that, for those ozone levels, and that electrifying trucks and buses will be a big air quality strategy. And so this chart, the details aren't super important, but basically NYSERDA, it's from a NYSERDA report, and found that the health benefits from electrifying are apparent across the state. And this put a dollar value, this analysis put a dollar value on each combustion vehicle that we replace with an EV, which, you know, the numbers, I guess, not as important for my purposes here, as much as saying that, you know, there's a key health benefit to the transition to electric vehicles. Next slide, please. All right, so in this slide, this is from the integration analysis that accompanied the scoping plan. And the upshot here is that we need to basically phase out combustion vehicles as fast as possible and rapidly deploy electric trucks and buses. What these charts show, basically, on the left-hand side is new vehicle sales, and the right box is on-road stocks of vehicles. And the orange, the dark orange and the light orange that you see there is diesel and gasoline. And so basically, as you see on the left box, we need to squeeze down the new sales of diesel and gasoline vehicles extremely quickly here in the short term. And I think this mirrors what Adam talked about in terms of the broader policy recommendations, but really squeezing down gasoline and diesel and ramping up zero emissions, which are these green bars, which is fuel cells and battery electric. And part of the reason why we have to act so aggressively now to meet the 2030 and 2050 mandates within the CLCPA is because of this rightmost box, which shows on-road fleets, on-road stocks. And part of the problem is that when you buy a new car, it stays on the road for about 10 years, 12 years. And for commercial vehicles, it's often longer, 15, 20 years sometimes. And so that slow fleet turnover really makes it clear that we need early action now to keep the CLCPA mandates within reach. And so that's all I wanted to show with these graphs, but really important point to emphasize here. Next slide, please. So when we think about how we're actually going to get the job done, Adam and Chris laid out some of the policy kind of architecture around how we're going to get those emissions down to a level that is consistent with the CLCPA. This breakdown comes from another NYSERDA report and finds that these zero emission vehicle sales mandates, they really do the heavy lifting. The middle yellow box here shows how many, like the level of transportation sector emissions under a business as usual case by 2050. And then the green rectangles are the emissions reductions we achieve by adopting the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and the Advanced Clean Trucks regulations that Chris talked about. And so you see they really do the lion's share of the emissions reductions in terms of just the single policies that achieve a huge amount of emissions reductions. Those are the big ticket items from the transportation sector. But what we also see is this rightmost set of rectangles and bars. That's quite a substantial amount of emissions that are still remaining, even with those policies in place, that we need a lot more policy attention, creative policies, and focused, targeted policies to really address these remaining rectangles. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about in the rest of the presentation here. Next slide, please. But I do, and because of time constraints, I can't really go into everything that I want to talk about in the transportation chapter, but I do think it's important to talk about, at least point out to folks that there is a really important VMT reduction aspect to meeting the transportation benchmarks in the scoping plan, VMT being vehicles miles traveled. So which means basically the state needs to invest and expand transit and rail to help get rid of some discretionary vehicle trips and turn them into public transit trips. And so some of the modeling that the state used found that by 2050, we need to reduce 3.7 billion vehicles miles traveled per year through enhanced transit and 10.8 billion vehicle miles traveled through expanded rail and mode shifting. Scenario, and these are the different scenarios that you see in these charts. Scenario 4 has more aggressive models, more aggressive VMT reduction. So it's a really important part of how we get to the net zero transportation sector that we're looking for. Next slide, please. Where are we going? So yeah, so I want to do a deep dive within the deep dive, I guess, onto the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector a little bit. So what's in the scoping plan? Adam went over most of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But in the vision for 2030 laid out by the Climate Action Council, a couple of things I want to call out: historic investments in public transportation and micromobility, potentially early retirement of ICE vehicles, and then on top of the sales requirements, purchase incentives, and infrastructure investments that we talked about earlier. And then looking at 2050, we need to be basically nearly completely through our transition off of combustion vehicles, really substantially increase the mode shifting. And then one thing that near and dear to my heart is the marine and port facilities should be zero emission by 2050. And the vision for 2050 also says early action and investment are needed now, kind of mirroring what I said a couple slides ago. All right, thanks. Next slide. This is just the overview of the transportation recommendations, policy recommendations. I'm going to focus on a couple of them here in the next slide, please. Adoption of zero emission trucks, buses, and non-road equipment, T2. Chris covered one of the big ticket items there, the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, and then T5, fleet modernization and electrification. So those are the two policy recommendations that really focus on electrifying and converting truck and bus fleets to zero emissions. And so within T2, you see there's a handful of specific recommendations that made it into the final scoping plan: adopting the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, enhanced ZEV incentives, a zero emission state fleet, requiring use of zero emission vehicles by state contractors at targeted facilities, investments in charging and fueling infrastructure. And then T5 just had one real component to it, which was transitioning to zero emission public transportation fleets. I've circled a couple of these here because those, we've heard from Chris that it looks like the state is actively considering the Advanced Clean Fleets Regulation, and we're waiting on California to finalize that rule, which actually hopefully could get us to 100% truck sales to be zero emissions as well. Right now, you saw on the chart that doesn't quite get us to 100% for zero emissions on the truck and bus side. So hopefully that can become, get codified in California and then in New York State in short order. And then I also highlighted here the zero emission state fleet, which Adam mentioned the executive order, and there was also legislation passed that will help expedite that transition. And there are quite a lot of incentives also, obviously, that we talked about, and there is some work on the infrastructure side. But I think there's a lot more basically work to be done on moving forward those other aspects of the recommendations within T2 and then T5 as well. There was some state commitments and funding to support zero emission public transit, but we are no mandate, no binding policy in effect in New York State right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So what more is needed? So yeah, next slide. So I think I mentioned it. Yeah, I mentioned at the top that we really view addressing diesel medium and heavy duty diesel powered medium and heavy duty vehicles as one of the key imperatives at the nexus of environment and public health. And for that reason, and it's really an equity issue ultimately, right? And then so I just wanted to highlight this part of the scope of the CLCPA, which calls on the state to prioritize measures to maximize reductions of greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities. And so when we think about that construct, so we're not just talking about emissions reductions, we're talking about targeted emissions reductions in disadvantaged communities that are already experiencing burdens, and over, as I showed in that previous slide, are breathing worse air than the average New Yorker. And so we need to really address that through the CLCPA. That equity dimension is really critical here. So next slide. So how do we do that? The way that we think about this issue is by policy making that will target and focus on high impact facilities and infrastructure that are largely sited in and near communities of color and with low income communities. So when we think about what facilities meet those characteristics, we're talking about mega warehouses, bus depots, ports, rail yards, highways, things of that nature. And so we need to really prioritize, kind of work backwards and target, how do we get the dirty fleets off of the, to stop impacting the communities? How do we electrify those facilities in those areas first, the ones that are having the biggest impact on regional and local air quality and public health? And I want to call out the New York City just released their latest community air survey. And one of the key findings of their report kind of corroborates some of what's in this slide. But basically, they found that in contrast to previous times they've run the analysis, it seems like higher density of warehouses is more associated with poor air quality in terms of neighborhood by neighborhood variation of air quality. And so it highlights a few parts of the city that have seen these unmitigated booms and proliferation in warehouses. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but certainly like focusing and targeting policymaking efforts that really lead to this status quo, which is unacceptable from an equity and public health standpoint. So next slide. So what this slide shows, this is from a report that came out this year, which looked at what happens when we fully electrify the port of New York and New Jersey, just across the river there, but huge operation. And what are the consequences of fully electrifying? What kind of benefit does that generate? And so on the left map here, you see the dark orange. It's probably hard to see, but the dark orange is Elizabeth and the Port of New York, like really, right where the port operations are localized. But then you see the emissions kind of profile and radius drift into Brooklyn, into Manhattan, and out even into the South Shore of Long Island, where there's still measurable and significant PM exposures from those port operations. And so under a scenario where we fully electrify on the right-hand side, there are still quite a decent concentration of emissions that we need to address in some other ways, but the radius of exposure is greatly diminished. And so overall emissions, PM emissions, are reduced by nearly 2/3 if you electrify the port, and the area affected by port emissions, which is shrunk by 75%. So electrifying ports, freight hubs will have huge air quality, public health, and climate benefits, win-win-win across the board, and something we should really be prioritizing. Next slide. So what do we see as the key advocacy priorities here? So I talked about warehouses a couple slides ago. The Clean Deliveries Act would start to, right now those facilities are unregulated at the state level. So we were working with a coalition of folks in the Electrify NY coalition to push this legislation that would create air pollution mitigation plans for warehouses to make sure that they're doing their part to help the state meet its climate standards and to really help clean up the communities and benefit the workers in which they're located. We're also working on the Green Transit, Green Jobs legislation, which just passed the Senate Transportation Committee this year, that would create a mandate to phase out diesel buses starting in 2029 for new purchases, and then has a lot of really important worker and good jobs provisions as well, and then also some transition planning associated with that. And then our other advocacy priorities is making sure that when the Advanced Clean Fleets rule is adopted in California, that New York State quickly adopts it. It looks like we're headed in that direction, which is great to see, but we're definitely going to be urging on that front. Adam mentioned the Bond Act. We're really trying to make sure that money is implemented in a way that prioritizes disadvantaged communities and communities of color across the state that are breathing the dirty air. And sometimes that means more work on the front end, because those kinds of school districts might not be ready to, have all the necessary kind of prerequisites for early electrification, but we need to really make sure that we're prioritizing those. Improving planning around transportation projects. So that includes, like, can we get better measurements for the greenhouse gas and emissions impact for new highway and transportation spending? And can we, evaluate alternatives to maybe figure out if there's some projects that don't need to go forward? Can we use, kind of better, lower emissions alternatives in those processes? And I didn't mention, I should have added, we're doing a decent amount of work here on infrastructure investments at the PSC and other the state DOT and other places to make sure that the infrastructure is available where we need it, when we need it. I'll stop there. That's my last real slide, and I guess we can pass it back off to Nick.
Wonderful. Alok, thank you. It was an excellent multiple series of deep dives into a lot of very important topics. So we've got some great questions that are popping up in the chat. I'm going to get to those in just a minute, but I'm going to selfishly take the first question. I'll call that moderators right here, and just ask everybody on the panel to just go around and say a little bit more about the feasibility of these goals. We've talked about a lot of programs at the state level, a lot of programs at the federal level. Adam, you highlighted those in particular that pointed out some of the things that will help with the funding. So I guess a question, since a lot of us on this call are advocates, is, what should the advocacy community be thinking about in terms of making sure that the plans that we've laid out stay feasible and moving forward? So just pop that to everybody, I guess.
So, I mean, no one's saying that this is going to be easy. And feasibility is obviously a key question. I think one of the big challenges is just, there's so much to be done. How do you prioritize? How do you figure out which of these things is really the most critical to get done first and second, and what's the sequencing? Because there's only legislature is only in session for so many weeks a year. The regulatory process takes a long time. Coming up with money takes a long time. All this is a challenge. As I don't have a really great answer about how do we make sure that it's all feasible, other than trying to get on the same page about which of these are really the top priorities, and which of these do we need to be pushing now? Which of these maybe can wait a year or two? Not that we want to push it off, but just because from a practical standpoint, there are only so many of us and only so many hours in a day. And that's really one of the big challenges here.
I can just, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just gonna, add on to that certainly how people can help us is during our rulemaking process, right? To hear those voices loudly that support and why they support those things, during our public comment period, during our hearings, those are important to us. Just like getting negative input is important to us, and to see what we might need to change. Obviously, we think the things that we go out with as regulations are feasible. I mean, that's part of our evaluation. Certainly there's a whole bunch of challenges going to electrification from where we've been, right? So everybody recognizes that. Adam's group works a lot on that. I guess I would just say, continued support and keeping those things on our radar that are concerning to you, or where you don't think we're doing quite enough, or, conversely, where you think we have missed the mark and we've maybe overestimated the ability for certain things to happen. We need that input as well.
And I'll just piggyback off of what Adam and Chris laid out. And there's a lot to say about feasibility, and maybe some of that will come up even in further questions. I know a lot of people have questions about the grid side and how to manage some of the growth on that. But one of the things that I want to touch on that Adam mentioned is really maybe the unsexy part of the energy transition, and it's really yeah, we need to, one thing that we can do is to really robustly fund our state agencies so that, there's only so many Adams and Chris's out there. And if all these regulations and rules that we need to get in place, they take expertise, they take, they need dedicated resources. And then we think about the Bond Act funding, and every time there's a new cap and invest, like that's going to take a lot of, and it's very timely now. We're in budget season still here. So, so I think, really making sure that we're encouraging our lawmakers and encouraging our elected officials to fund the agencies that are responsible for the energy transition, so it's not zero sum, and that they can take on and do a really good job in managing some of these programs, and then the more to come as we get deeper and deeper into the transition. So I think kind of putting money behind that in the agencies themselves, and then just in terms of incentive programs and the direct to consumer kind of approach as well.
We did not tell Alok to say
that. That's wonderful. And I have so many follow-up questions to that, but I'm going to hold them because I want to pivot to the Q&A box and just start with some of the questions that we've got here. So one good one that's come in is about reducing vehicle miles traveled. So the question is, we can do a tremendous amount on electrification. It sounds like there are lots of plans being laid in that arena. And Adam, you mentioned in your presentation some of what needs to happen on reducing vehicle miles traveled. So would love it if folks could talk a little bit about what's necessary here to do that. And there's an intersection here with another question, which I think really gets to the question of land use planning and reducing and reversing sprawl. So we can maybe combine both of those into one or tackle them separately if you want. Would love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure, I'm happy to start saying a little bit more, and then others feel free to chime in. So land use is one of the toughest challenges that we face in meeting these goals, because for a number of reasons. Number one, the state has less control over that than it has over most of these other topics. Number two, it's a very long-term trend and a long-term slow-moving solution as a result. We've highlighted a few things in the scoping plan that I think are realistic. One is just focusing new development in infill type locations where we are increasing density and reusing land in places where it's not being used to its highest capacity now. That's something that we can certainly provide incentives for and work with local communities to do, but at the end of the day, land use decisions are a local decision in New York State, and unless that's going to change, which I don't anticipate anytime soon, we're stuck with that. So part of it is that. Part of it is making sure that for folks who do live in areas that can be well served and by transit or micromobility or other low carbon modes that I think are really conducive to A, reducing VMT, and B, reducing sprawl, that we make those modes available to them. And we can't be I think we need to think a little bit more broadly about how we are showing that this is a real possibility. NYSERDA last year announced 10 winners of the Clean Transportation Prizes, which are many of which are focused on proving out the feasibility and the economic perspectives for shared mobility and micromobility in lower income and disadvantaged communities. And we think that this is a real and just simply different communities than, like, we all know that it can work in Manhattan. And there's no question there, but can it work in Kingston? Can it work in Elmira? Can it work in Plattsburgh? Some of these mid-sized cities in the state that, Zipcar and Lyft and, these companies are not going to go invest in on their own. So how can we make that happen? How can we work with transit operators? How can we work with the local communities to make that happen? Putting more money toward that, more money toward more reliable and frequent transit service, I think is all going to be part of the solution there.
Thank you, Adam. Chris, want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have much to add really from my standpoint. Obviously, the thing that we can do is obviously encourage public transportation and support that with funding when we have opportunities, when things come up like the VW funding, put funding toward a lot of that funding towards, clean transportation projects. Other than that, the land use is something we always deal with, not just from transportation, but from air permitting, stationary source type issue, run into zoning issues where facilities maybe are located where it would have been better if they hadn't been, things like that. So that's certainly a challenge, and something like Adam said that we're never gonna, I think, kind of have the control over. So we deal with it the best we can. But I don't know that, some of the other things mentioned here about rail and that, I don't know how much ability we have there. Certainly those are things we support because it's public transportation, and we would always support those projects.
And if I can just add a little bit here, I'm a little bit, I'm definitely going to be out of my depth in terms of we're talking too much about land use, and that's definitely not my area of expertise. But I think there are some, Earthjustice, I'll say, is a supporter of, for example, the 6-minute service campaign. I think there's a lot that we can do, even in regions that have public transit systems that have, like New York City, obviously, with the subway, to make sure that there are still people every day that opt to take a car or take a taxi or for hire vehicle instead of the train or the bus for a variety of reasons, even if they are served by routes, and maybe because because the trains don't come frequently enough, whatever the case may be. But for folks that live in parts of the state that are suited for those kinds of public transit or other kinds of low carbon modes, we need to make sure that they're choosing to do that and not choosing to get in their car or hire a car if we can avoid it. And then the other thing is, we look, in terms of the freight and goods movement, I think there's parts of the state where we're not maybe leveraging our freight rail and marine transport of goods and things like that still need to be studied. I don't think there's a immediate off-the-shelf policy recommendation there that can help reduce DMT from the freight and goods movement. But I think there is more to be done, and a lot of entities, including New York City agencies, have looked at this. But I think it's time that we, kind of go past the study phase and really figure out how we can implement some of those changes to get some of the trucks off the road as well.
And Alok, you teed up my next question for everybody, which really focuses a little bit more on freight and on intercity trips, and looking at the feasibility of doing high-speed and very high-speed rail, electrified rail in New York State. Curious, one of the questions coming in the chat is, has the plan considered any of this, and what's feasible there?
I know that was discussed as in the at least in the transportation advisory panel that informed the plan. I think that it wasn't highly emphasized in the plan, not that it's totally off the table, but it wasn't one of the main focus areas of the plan. I think that from a cost benefit standpoint, the costs of getting to higher speed rail in New York State are going to be very substantial. Both from you look at the Amtrak lines that exist now, you're not going to be able to run a train at 100 miles an hour along between New York and Albany. It would fly off the tracks. So there are some clear needs there for that are going to be multi-billion-dollar type projects to make headway there. I know we've all seen what's going on in California with their high-speed rail and some of the challenges that they're facing. I'll never say never, but I think it was just not one of the top ones that rose to to the top of the list once factoring all those things in.
Somebody who lived in California for a long time before moving to New York about 12 years ago, the dream of high-speed rail between LA and Vegas, it's been something I've seen my entire life, and it's inching forward a little bit at a time. Now it looks like, the company that runs Brightline is interested in it. So, here's hoping California solutions actually move forward, and maybe New York can follow suit one day as well. Alok, is there something you wanted to add on that question?
I just wanted to point out that, I had a slide that looked at, okay, even if we do these big electrification measures, where do the emissions remain? And a big chunk of the emissions that remain are aviation. And I think, it's really hard, the problem with some of this stuff is that it's really hard to change behaviors and things like that. But I do think there's, when we look at it nationally too, I think there is an imperative to figure out how can we replace short haul. I think it's gonna be hard to maybe electrify, a lot of flights, but if we can electrify, if we can replace short haul trips that could be covered by regional rail or long distance rail with, I think that's something that, that's just we have to figure out how to do that. I think, I think it's going to be hard, certainly, and people get comfortable doing what they're doing. But, that aviation chunk of emissions, people don't talk a lot about it because there's not really much that we know exactly what to do about it right now. And I think there are some ideas out there, how a lot of the focus is on the long haul flights. I mean, that seems really hard to address, but if we can get people to stop taking, really short flights and take the train instead, don't fly from New York to Boston, take the train instead. That would make a big difference.
Wonderful. I want to pivot back to EVs for just a moment. Got some questions pertaining to that. And I guess what I want to wrestle with is a little bit about the grid and what is necessary in order to ensure that we have two things. One, a charging infrastructure that takes into account how people need to charge and what we can do to make sure that those charging solutions work for communities holistically, by balancing everybody's needs and objectives. And then the second thing there is, once we built that grid out, how do we make sure that we have the necessary power generation and clean power generation to make sure that people are able to charge when and where they need to in ways that are affordable. And Adam, you touched on that a little bit in your presentation. I'm not going to single you out and ask you to go first. Anybody who wants to take that can.
Happy to if no one else wants to, but we have seen some of the challenges with electrification very acutely in the last year since New York State passed really, I think, the most ambitious school bus electrification mandate in the country, as far as I know. Where all new school bus purchases must be zero emission by 2027, and all school buses in the state must be zero emission by 2035. And just for context, New York has more school buses than any other state in the country. Over 40,000. So there's a lot that has to happen there. For a lot of schools, both urban and rural, there just isn't electricity at their anywhere near enough electricity at their depots to actually be able to electrify their buses. And so, this is where the collaboration with the utilities, creative thinking about other non-wire alternatives, and proactive investment to make sure that we can update the service to depots, the minimum number of times, so that we don't have to keep going back in every year or two as schools buy more electric buses, is going to be really important. That's just kind of one microcosm of this bigger challenge. And we're seeing schools who are afraid that they're not going to be able to do this, not because they don't want to, but because they can't get the power in time. And they don't want to have buses sitting on the lot that they can't use. That obviously doesn't look good for the voters who have to approve their budgets each year, and isn't good for, it isn't good for anyone to have buses that can't charge. So I I think that the steps that the PSC is taking right now to enable proactive and investment in grid upgrades where we know that they're going to be needed, so that we can make sure that there is power available when the buses or trucks or cars or whatever charging is needed, is going to be really important to meeting these aggressive goals. Sometimes some of these projects from the utilities could take 8 to 10 years, and we need to be starting these, getting smart and starting these investments now if it really is going to take that much time. Otherwise, we're just never going to be able to hit our targets.
Thank you, Adam. And I'm going to piggyback off of that with another question too, which is, how can we make sure that as we're building out all of this infrastructure, you pointed out New York State has the largest number of school buses. We obviously have the largest transit system in the country. I've often likened this to the Texas textbook situation, where the way that California and Texas describe their textbooks need to look often dictates how textbooks look for everybody in the country, because they're just such big markets. Similarly, we're very big markets for a lot that needs to happen in the medium and heavy duty sector. How can we make sure that as we're building this out, we're capturing the jobs that could be created here, the manufacturing jobs, the supply chain jobs? What does it look like? What are we doing to move the ball forward in that way?
I'll just chime in real quick and then let others, but it's something that we've certainly had conversations with Empire State Development about, and are really encouraging the state to push hard, because and see how we can integrate that into procurements and things like that, because MTA is the biggest purchaser of buses in the country, and surprise surprise, there are bus components and buses that are built in New York. There are rail cars built in New York because MTA is the biggest purchaser. We should be pushing this and really trying hard to make make the case to anyone out there who is looking for to build new facilities, that New York is the place to be.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think we routinely have some interactions with Empire State Development on certain projects that they are looking at to attract to the state. So we have a role there. Obviously, if there's a new facility, we have a role there as well, right? In permitting that facility and making sure that air quality from that facility as well is controlled very, very well. So, we try to work with them, certainly are all for any development that they can bring to the state, and make sure that we can provide the, the clean air that we're always after from those sources as well.
And just an observation to build off of what Adam and Chris said, the how we use our public dollars is an important way to how we can advance not just New York jobs, but good family sustaining jobs in these sectors. And one thing that we've seen some from when you look at the national level, and some of the federal clean school bus program, for example, I know that certain entities that have put in orders for electric school buses, that there's manufacturing facilities kind of shift in that direction. And so it's not necessarily a guarantee or anything like that, but early action, by being a first mover or an early actor in terms of getting some assurances to the market, mandates and robust state incentive programs, for example, can send a signal to the market that, okay, hey, New York's going to be in this for the long term, and they're going to be in there now. And so let's think about setting up shop close by. So I think that kind of being that leader is and first out of the gate kind of helps in that regard.
And speaking of building markets out, one of the challenges that we do have in New York State, and I say this as someone who's an EV owner myself, is the direct to consumer sales barrier. So I'm curious, Adam and others, if there are thoughts around how to address that outside of legislation, or if you see other ways through that particular challenge.
My understanding is that it's a legislative issue. I don't see other paths. I know that there have been a lot of discussions in the legislature, and a number of the key players have had a lot of discussions over the last few years on this topic. That's not something that NYSERDA gets directly involved with, but my understanding is that it's a legislative issue.
Wonderful.
I would agree that that's my understanding is also, and we have had, discussions with a number of people on it, but it's not, again, our role to like kind of push that or support it. We just listen and bring up issues or concerns that we may have. I'm not aware that we have any big concerns there, but it's kind of out of our hands, unfortunately.
Okay, wonderful, everybody. I'm going to ask one final lightning round question, answers 10 seconds or less. And that is, if you could say one thing that you wish the general public knew about everything that New York is doing at this point to electrify and transform transportation in the state, what would it be? Just one sentence.
I would say pay attention to the what the Public Service Commission and the utilities are doing. There's a new docket on medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification there, and that's where a lot of these enabling policies are going to happen.
Thanks, Alok.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, obviously, it's pay attention to what we're working on, what regulations we have on the out there for public notice and public comment, and give us your input. That's always important to us.
And I guess I would just say that from the consumer centric standpoint, the number of EVs has shot up over the last few years that are available. The number of clean buses and both transit and school buses has really expanded. Micromobility has expanded. There are just so many more options today than there were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We need to keep doing more, but we're heading in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Deb, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks. I want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar today, Nick and Adam and Chris and Alok. Thanks so much for sharing your information about our climate plan and what's in the transportation chapter. This webinar, the slides and the video will be up on ACE's website at aceny.org. And if you registered for this webinar ahead of time, you'll be receiving the slides and recording in your email. And please join us on May 18th. We will be having another webinar that will be taking a deep dive into the electricity chapter. So thank you all for coming today. And I hope to see you in May 18th.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.